Tonight we are reading Paul Jennings' The Cabbage Patch War. I haven't read this one before. Okay. My brother Chris is still only 8 years old, which is rather young to go to war. Well, go to war is probably not quite the way to put it, but there was a battle and Chris was right in the middle of it. That's for certain. It all started at lunchtime. The whole 8 of us, 6 kids and Mum and Dad, were sitting at the table looking at something awful. Dad gave a big smile. I bought 6 dozen oysters, he said. That's 72 altogether. He nodded at me. So how many do we get each? Dad is always giving us little sums to do in our heads. It drives me crazy. I know, said Sky. None. They are disgusting. I'm not touching them. Okay, said Dad. 72 divided by 7, that makes 10 each and 2 left over. I'd better eat the last 2 just to be fair. None for me, thanks, I said. Me neither, said Hayden. Revolting. They are foul, said Julie, nearly as bad as Cabbage. She put a finger in her mouth, pretending to make herself sick. Yuck, 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 said Chris. Jack is too young for oysters, said Mum, and you know that I don't like them, dear. Dad looked a bit hurt, but only for a second. Okay, he said, I'll just have to eat them all myself. And he did. We sat there and watched while Dad shoveled in all those oysters. It was a horrible sight, but there was a reason for it. Poor Dad had an eating problem. It began the day he dug out the cabbages and put in onions. The onions died, so he tried cabbages again, but they just wouldn't grow. It almost seemed as if the garden was mad at him. Only one little cabbage was still alive. Dad was sad. Growing cabbages is my hobby, he said. I've lost my touch. I'm a failure. So he turned to eating junk food instead. Pizza, hamburgers, prawns, trifle, chips, you name it, and he ate it. Beer too. He loved his beer. On a warm summer's evening, he would sit in the backyard with a beer in his hand and stare at the dead vegetable patch. It was a very sad sight. Sometimes he would give his big beer belly a pat just to make himself feel better. Anyway, to get back to the oysters, Dad shoveled about 50 of them into his mouth without stopping. Then he started to slow down. That's enough, dear, said Mum. You'll make yourself ill. But Dad kept going, slower and slower. We all watched in silence. Something bad was going to happen. I just knew it was. Finally, Dad stopped eating. There was only one oyster left. Don't eat it, Dad, I said. Give up. Oh, foul, yelled Sky. Revolting, said Hayden. Yuck, 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 said Chris. Give up, dear, said Mum. You know you've had enough. He feels sick, chuckled Julie. What a wimp. Dad glared around the table. Wimp, am I? I'll show you. He slowly lifted the last oyster to his mouth. His face was a bit green. He didn't look so good. He put the oyster in his mouth and closed his lips. He hasn't swallowed it, shouted Chris. It's still in his mouth. He can't get it down. Dad gave him a stubborn look and swallowed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes started to bulge. His stomach rumbled. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet and ran outside. A terrible, retching, splashing noise floated in through the window. The sound mixed with the laughter from inside. Dad was as sick as a dog. All the kids went outside to look at the vomit. 72 oysters, beer and bits of red and green stuff do not make a pretty sight, especially when they've been chewed up and swallowed first. None of the kids would clean it up. Neither would Mum. Neither would Mum. The hog always returns to its own vomit, she said. Everyone felt a bit ill. Except Dad. He scooped the sick up on the shovel and dug it in around the tiny cabbage. Good fertiliser, he said, with a grin. It was good fertiliser too. That cabbage grew to a huge size within a month. Dad watered it every night. He loved that cabbage. Anyone would have thought that it was a person. He patted it and loved it like it was a baby. He didn't feel like a failure anymore. Everything was good until the beginning of the war. See, Dad decided to have a barbecue, but he didn't invite our neighbour, Whacker. I was a bit upset because his daughter Robin was my best friend. I want Robin to come, I said. It's only for the cricket club, said Dad. Whacker can't play cricket for nuts. The day of the barbecue arrived. The new gas barbecue was fired up. The first stubby was opened and the first sausage started to sizzle. There was a lot of laughing and joking. The CD was pumping out Dad's old Irish music. The sun was shining, perfect except that Robin wasn't there. And then it happened. Smoke. Not nice barbecue smoke. Stinking, swirling smoke coming from over the fence. Everyone started to cough and choke and rub their eyes. It was terrible. The smoke was so thick that it blotted out the sun. Strike, yelled Dad. Where's that coming from? He tried to pull himself up to peer over the fence, but he couldn't quite manage it. His beer pot was bigger than ever. He grabbed a chair and stood on it. Then he peered down into Whacker's garden. Gee, said Dad, Whacker's having a burn-off. Today of all days. Oh no. Chris scrambled up and sat on the fence with him. Whacker was setting fire to old tires and green branches that he'd cut from his trees. Hey, Whacker, yelled Dad, cut it out. We're having a barbecue over here. Yeah, said Chris, we're having a barbie. I know you are, said Whacker. You can hear it from miles away. Why don't you turn that music down? It's a terrible racket. Well, you can't have a party without music, said Dad. And you can't have a fire without smoke, said Whacker. Dad glared over the fence. Put out that fire. You turn off that music. Never, said Dad. Get nicked then, yelled Whacker through the smoke. He threw another branch on the fire with an evil chuckle. Whacker had a very mean laugh. He also had a beer gut that was just as bad as Dad's. In fact, Whacker and Dad had the biggest beer bellies in the district. Suddenly, Dad grinned to himself. Then he rushed across the garden and fetched the hose. He fixed a sprinkler to the end, the sort you can adjust to spray wherever you want. He set it on the ground and turned on the tap. Get him, Dad, yelled Chris. He is so immature, is Chris. I will, son, I will, said Dad. A huge jet of water shot up over the fence and fizzled down onto the fire. In no time at all, the fire was out. Dad looked like a general who had just won a huge battle. He was very happy with what he had done.